Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours, the travel company led by reporters around the world. Back in 2021, Barnaby Phillips released a book which I think is fair to say had a dramatic impact on the world of museums and art collection. Loot, Britain and the Benin Bronzes looked at the theft by a punitive colonial force of the prized collection of ceremonial figures from the ruler of the Kingdom of Benin, which is in modern-day Nigeria. Its publication, the book, added significant weight to a clamour for museums and private collectors alike to return what had been taken during that 1897 raid. It also examined the enormous complexities surrounding the issue of restitution. Barnaby will have a new book out that looks at a similar tale, which focuses on another raid and a different set of treasure, known as the Ashanti or Santi gold. Barnaby joins us now. Hello and welcome.
Hi, Nick. Great pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much. You led a wonderful two-day tour, which we're going to reschedule again in the autumn. We're going to set the date soon, and I do recommend people come and get in touch and ask about that, because it was a fantastic and fascinating 2 days that looked at this issue in depth. But I was just looking back at the number of institutions that handed back articles, basically parts of the Benin Bronzes, after you published your book. I mean, one could argue whether it's coincidence or not, but it did happen after the publication of your book. The Smithsonian, the Horniman, University of Cambridge, University of Aberdeen, Great North Museum in Newcastle, the Netherlands, Germany, a whole list of stuff that really happened afterwards. I know you this debate was increasing at the time, but I think it's fair to say you have had a big impact. So listen, why write this second book? Why there's been obviously a big focus on the Benin Bronzes, but the issue is the same. Why produce this second book?
Well, I think you've hinted at it there, Nick. The issues have remained so topical, and I'm so fascinated by them. Although they've remained topical, I think the world has changed a little bit as well, say from 2021 when my book about the Benin Bronzes came out. I think there's been something of a backlash against Black Lives Matter, for example, in the United States. In particular, there was a certain political climate, I suppose, coming out of the pandemic, 2020, 2021, after the murder of George Floyd in the United States, where a whole debate about colonialism, racism, if you like, for want of a better word, the legacy of empire, particularly obviously here in Europe, came to a head and honed in on museums. I don't think that has gone away. I think museums are still struggling with those issues. And I was particularly fascinated by the Ashanti gold taken from modern-day Ghana, because I noticed that the British Museum, which is so often in the middle of these debates, and the V&A as well, were grappling to deal with that legacy. And in the middle of 2024, they took back to Kumasi, which was the capital of the Ashanti Kingdom, a large amount of gold which had been looted by the British Army in 1874 and 1896, and they gave it to the King's Museum there on long-term loan. And I was fascinated by watching those two institutions, above all the British Museum, trying to work its way through these debates.
And that is remarkable, of course, because Parliament in the late 60s, or maybe later than that, passed this legislation that prevented them from handing back any of their collection.
That's right. Actually, 1963, the British Museum Act. So, there's been a debate that has gone on for decades. Does the British Museum hide behind that act? Is it an excuse for it not to do things that it doesn't want to do anyway, like give back the Elgin marbles, the Parthenon marbles, give back the Benin Bronzes? Is that a convenient excuse? Or is it constrained by that act and it would like more freedom? In fact, those tensions are played out within the British Museum. They're played out within the V&A. Tristram Hunt, the director of the V&A, would like the law to change. Nicholas Cullinan, the new director of the British Museum, does not want that law to change, or at least is not overtly interested in in giving things.
Fascinating. Two different sort of political tracks, if you like. Well, let's talk about the actual story of the Ashanti gold. I think people watching here will know a bit about the Benin Bronzes because we've done several talks with you, and obviously we have the tour as well. But tell us about what happened with the Ashanti gold. 2 raids, not just 1.
Yeah, the incredible thing is that there were actually 5 Anglo-Ashanti wars. The first is at the beginning of the 19th century, and the last is at the very beginning of the 20th century. So there are a series of wars in which Britain, obviously the preeminent global power of the 19th century, is fighting perhaps the most powerful kingdom in West Africa. But the real crux, the denouement, is 1874, when a British army under the command of Sir Garnet Wolseley marches into Kumasi, destroys the king's palace, he's called the Asantehene, and loots the gold which is in the palace. Asante, as a kingdom, has had 2 principal sources of wealth which have enabled it to rise to this great position. One has been the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade, and the other has been its great reserves of gold. They destroy the palace, they come back to Britain, and the loot is auctioned. A lot of it goes to even the royal family, aristocratic families. A lot of it goes to the British Museum and the V&A. But they don't take over the Ashanti Kingdom. The wars rumble on. In 1896, a British army returns. It loots the palace again. It sends the king of the Ashanti into exile in the Seychelles. He's away for 28 years. In 1900, there is one more war. So eventually, inevitably, of course, the Ashanti Empire is defeated, incorporated into the British Museum. But that hope that their treasure would be returned to them did not go away. Negotiations almost reached a successful conclusion in the 1970s. In fact, there's long correspondence between the British Museum, the British government, and the Ashanti Kingdom. At that time, it all falls apart. But in 2023, the Asantehene, sensing the moment, seeing what was happening, the sorts of things you were talking about the Benin Bronzes, seeing a new debate in Europe about the legacy of colonialism, seized his chance again. Now, I should say the king of the Ashantis is a fairly conservative man. He's a pal of King Charles. He loved to go and have tea with the Queen. He owns a large house in Henley. He's not a radical at all. And so he was able, I suppose, to work with the British establishment. He's an Anglophile, to pull off this quite unusual loan deal. It's a controversial deal. It's upset a lot of people in Ghana, but I think he would say that the ends justify the means.
Yeah, and how does that contrast with Nigeria and the Benin Bronzes, which is obviously had more attention in a way?
The Benin Bronzes have had more attention. That's true. The difference, I would say, is in the politics of the respective countries. Nigerian politics are much messier, much more difficult, and the king of Benin, the Oba, is a less powerful figure within the polity of Nigeria than the king of the Ashanti is within Ghana. And that's why, for all the favorable publicity around returns of Benin Bronzes, at the Nigerian end, quite frankly, it's been a mess, with state governors, the National Museum Commissioner, and the king all wanting a piece of the action. Shockingly, not a single returned Benin Bronze has actually gone on public display in Nigeria yet. This is an awkward fact that people don't like to talk about very much in the restitution debate. Whereas in Ghana, certainly noses were put out of joint in the Ghanaian government that this cozy bilateral deal was done between the British Museum, the V&A, and the King of the Ashanti, but the King of the Ashanti gets his way. He has the wealth, the power within the Ghanaian polity to get his way. And these objects have gone back not to a public Ghanaian government-owned museum, but to his private palace museum in Kumasi.
Okay, I mean, there's so much to talk about, and there are numerous different angles to approach. I mean, part of it, this is about I mean, you define these arguments very well in your first book. You've got the legal restrictions upon the British Museum. You've got this overwhelming moral pressure on them. But then you've got a concept of sovereignty surrounding artifacts or things of significant ceremonial or even religious importance, and the question of ownership. There's a sort of moral question of ownership. And I think what you're hinting at there is that okay, they belonged to the Oba and they need to go back to the Oba. But hang on a second, what's he doing with them, and who has the right to say what he should be doing with them?
These issues are tremendously complex because obviously in Nigeria, Nigeria did not exist in 1897 when the British invaded the Kingdom of Benin. Nigeria is a British creation. It dates from 1914, and many Nigerians regret profoundly that their country was assembled in that way, and will argue candidly that it does not make sense. The Ashanti Kingdom obviously long predates the independent country of Ghana. 1957, Ghana became independent. 1960, Nigeria became independent. So, if you like, we've left African countries with those messy situations and those legacies that they have to try and navigate. But what you were hinting at is absolutely right. I've been talking about gold treasures, Benin Bronzes, objects of art, in some cases objects trading for millions of pounds or dollars in the art market here in the West. But to the people who made them, there was a very different concept. They were objects with a spiritual, a religious significance, and that is their value. And no, they're not intended to be, they were not made with the intention that they would be sitting in glass vitrines in museums and admired on an aesthetic level, which ironically is what has happened to the Ashanti gold, which has gone back to the Mancha Palace Museum. If you like, it has been, perhaps you might argue, robbed of its spiritual or its ceremonial, its political power, if you like, and it is within a glass box. So to that extent, it has been changed, perhaps permanently, by its long sojourn here in the United Kingdom.
Yeah, but nevertheless, this question of how those objects are going to be looked after or treated when they're returned. I mean, I'm trying to come up with an analogy. If someone's come to my house and nicked a painting of mine, and they say, well, we're keeping it because we can look after it better than you. It's like, no, I'm entitled to, if I want to ruin that painting, I can.
Absolutely. I can't steal your car and refuse to give it back because you haven't got a nice garage, as they like to say in Nigeria. And just by way of example, Nick, earlier in 2024, a museum in Los Angeles that some of your viewers might know, the Fowler Museum, it's part of UCLA, they had a large collection of Ashanti looted artifacts, which had come through Henry Wellcome and ended up in California, but all the provenance is all there, taken, stolen, if you like, by British soldiers in 1874. They chose to give their objects back to the Ashanti King in early 2024. And in marked contrast to what the British Museum and the V&A did, they said, here you are, have them back. They're yours. We have no moral right to them, and you do what you want with them. If you want to, take these objects out and use them in ceremonies and wave them around and parade them, that's fine with us. In fact, that's great. That's what they're there for. But frankly, it's none of our business. Whereas the British Museum and the V&A gave objects back not only on loan, but with strict contractual obligations about security, about who was paying for insurance, about fire safety, all the rest of it, which the Ashanti agreed to go along with. And
I suppose you might try and argue that there's a global, you've got institutions like UNICEF, not UNICEF, sorry, my brain's going, UNESCO, sorry, my acronyms. there is a sense of there is a global sovereignty when it comes to objects, or I'm saying things of such global importance, that some people argue that it is not just because the pyramids are in Egypt doesn't mean they're not part of a global patrimony or whatever. So that the world has an interest in seeing those things preserved and well looked after.
Yes, that is a valid argument, and that is, I suppose, part of the British Museum's argument, that the Parthenon marbles, the Benin Bronzes, all the other contested objects in the British Museum, Ashanti gold, statues from Easter Island, you name it, they belong to the world. Their meaning has changed, and the British Museum would argue, isn't it wonderful that they can be in a building in the middle of London, a global city, visited by 6 million people, 6 million people visiting the institution every year, and a small, I mean, they wouldn't put it in these terms, but a small museum in Benin City would never be able to compete with that. And of course, the argument they also make as well is that they are able to display the full range of human achievement and variety of civilization within a single building. There's just nowhere else where you can walk through the finest statues of ancient Egypt, a progression, if you like, through Assyria into Greece, Rome, and guess what? You can also see everything that was happening in Africa, and you can try and draw your own connections. So they say that it would be a careless act of cultural vandalism to dismantle that collection.
Can you show us what some of the things we're talking about? I think you've got some slides tucked away there. It might take you a few seconds to rustle them up. But when we're talking about the Ashanti gold, what are the artifacts we're generally talking about? What collection were they part of? Tell us, and then tell us a bit about their story. I know that it'll take a second or two to do that.
Okay, so I'm pressing share. Am I sharing now? Can you see?
Yeah.
Well, that's a picture of the Asantehene himself, Osei Tutu II. I took that in Kumasi in November, and he's dripping in gold. You can see. I mean, it's just incredible when he comes out. I mean, unfortunately, my picture can't do justice to the noise, the cacophony, the muskets which are being fired in the air.
Fantastic photograph. It's an amazing photo.
All the rest of it. This was an incredible, very moving ceremony, actually, to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the return of King Prempeh from the Seychelles, where he had been in exile for, as I said, for a quarter of a century. A moment that meant so much to the Asantehene. And we, the British, the people who did this, we don't know anything about this at all. But the president of the Seychelles had flown to Kumasi for this ceremony, and it was deeply moving because, of course, these 50 or so Ashanti were in the Seychelles for a quarter of a century. Well, guess what? They had children. Some stayed, all the rest of it. And so long-lost Prempeh cousins came from the Seychelles to this extraordinary event in Kumasi. I'll carry on. So this is back to the Benin Bronzes.
Just a reminder, I mean, the Benin Bronzes, the photographs from the Benin Bronzes, I mean, they are shocking, aren't they? I mean, there's and if you come on the tour, the people some of the people who are sitting down, who have taken part in this raid, as well as the reporters who celebrated it, are all in St. Paul's Cathedral. I mean, you can see some of these key figures from these colonial expeditions venerated there, and they're part of our history. They're part of, and we accept that, but it is fascinating to see them there, and only now we're sort of questioning their role.
That's right. When we went through the crypt in St. Paul's and we saw all the key figures, Admiral Sir Harry Rawson, who led the Benin raid. You can see the British officers in the Oba's palace on the picture there. And you can see Oba of around when the Benin king being led into exile. He never saw his kingdom again. He's being taken away on a British military ship after the raid. But yeah, they're all there in the crypt. And the Benin Bronzes, I suppose, perhaps through their haunting beauty, I suppose the skill. When the curator Ormond Dalton saw the piece, the brass sculpture on the left, he said, as if from ancient Greece. I mean, cast through the cire perdu, the lost wax method, which is incredibly difficult to cast metal thinly that way, and then the haunting ivory mask on the right, which is in the British Museum.
Both absolutely stunning pieces, and
Stunning.
controversially held in the basement.
Held in the, yes, yeah, 16th century pieces. So that's Benin, of course, and here's Ashanti. And this is Thomas Bowditch, who is trained as a hatter in Bristol, and he leads the first expedition to the Ashanti Kingdom in 1817. And he comes back and writes this account in London of the kingdom, which the British know about. Of course, they've traded slaves from the coast. They've been on the Gold Coast for hundreds of years, but they've not been into the interior. And he writes this extraordinary account of all the majesty and the gold and the display on offer. And a lot of people don't believe him, but some people do believe him and think, wow, this is incredible. This is a powerful kingdom. We need to befriend it. We need to conquer it. We need to know more about it. So in many ways, that story begins that Anglo-Ashanti story begins in 1817. But I think the climax is 1874. These are British officers. They've captured Kumasi, and that is the King's Palace, that magnificent stone building. And the night after the British arrive, under the orders of General Sir Garnet Wolseley, one of these incredibly significant Victorian figures, almost forgotten today. We found his memorial, didn't we? Just a stone's throw away from Nelson in the crypt. He orders the destruction. He orders first that all the treasure be systematically taken out, a prize committee set up, as it was called, and then he orders the Royal Engineers to blow up the palace. Here you can see Wolseley entering Kumasi. Some rather dramatized pictures, of course.
And the premise for that raid is what? The premise for the just give us a brief historical background for that.
So I suppose just before the real scramble for Africa, but Britain's interests on the Gold Coast are beginning to harden, and there is a growing friction with the Ashanti Kingdom. And in 1873, the Ashanti Kingdom, which still argues that the coastal territories ultimately belong to it, invades the British protectorate. So you might say they started it, if you're putting it in very simple terms. And the British response is an extraordinary one. And I think General Sir Garnet Wolseley, the man supposedly on the horse in the middle there, he seizes the initiative. He's very ambitious. He gets 3 British battalions sent out to West Africa. First European army really ever to go into the sub-Saharan African interior. And you've got to remember, this is really before telegraphic communications, or rather they're just in their infancy. He's the man on the ground, and he can shape events pretty much as he wants. And here is the loot, which is taken in 1874. That's the Illustrated London News, a picture on the left. It's auctioned out at Garrard's, the Royal Jewellers on Piccadilly Haymarket. Very, very prestigious place. And I was going through the Garrard's ledgers for 1874, and it's a Burke's peerage written out in cursive handwriting. I mean, it's, every Royal Highness and Duke and Marchioness you've ever heard of is there. But the person who buys up the most is a man called Richard Wallace. Of course, we know him today through the Wallace collection, and that is an Ashanti gold head in the Wallace collection, which we went to see, Nick. And
the astonishing thing about that is that you could walk past that cabinet, and you haven't got a clue. I mean, you really don't know. I mean, it's. I mean, I think there are other. I remember going on school trips to places like the Pitt Rivers Museum, where you have the sort of the loot of empire encased in shelf after shelf, cabinet after cabinet, and you've just got no clue. And really, parts of the Wallace collection are still like that today.
It's true. In fact, the Wallace collection is really interesting. They have, quotes, the best Ashanti gold, the most expensive. They didn't even display any of it for many decades in the latter half of the 20th century. Going through their correspondence, it's clear that it stopped being displayed sometime around 1950. And they can't say for sure when it went back on display at the moment, but they think it was in the early 1980s. So they felt perhaps that these objects, maybe they've seen them as embarrassing, maybe they fit awkwardly within the wider Wallace collection with all its magnificent old masters and all the rest of it. Xavier Bray, who is the director of the Wallace collection, he would like to put on a big Ashanti exhibition, and he's talking to the Royal Palace, but he's, I suppose you would say, he's a temperamentally conservative man with a small c. He's not a restitutionista, but by any stretch.
I just want to highlight one of those. I mean, I don't know if you call it a ceremonial scythe, or it's with the. You can see in the photograph on the right-hand side, and then illustrated on the left, you can see those large those. I mean, they are. If I were to stretch out my arms completely, they are. I mean, they must be about a meter 20 long or something like that. I mean, they're maybe longer.
Yeah, massive objects, absolutely. So I'll show. What have we got next here, Nick? Let me see. Okay, so now we've rushed forward to 1896, and 1890. So now we really are in the high age of jingoistic imperialism, if you like. When we talk about the scramble for Africa, and this is, I think this is imperialism. I hesitate. I hesitate to attach values, and I like people to reach their own conclusions. But I think you might call this an ugly period of British imperialism. Joseph Chamberlain is the colonial secretary, and there is quite an aggressive bid to seize territory. An Ashanti delegation travels to London in 1895. Ashanti nobility say, we're going to go and talk to the Great White Queen ourselves and take our case. We want to be independent. We want to live peacefully with the British. And they are, unfortunately for them, while they are here, the Conservative government wins the election in the summer of 1895. I mean, they were onto a hiding to nothing anyway, to be honest, but that probably sealed the fate of their trip. And they are met, well, nobody important meets them, and they are treated with contempt, and they return home. The British have determined this time, not only will they send another army to Kumasi, but they will, at this point, do what they didn't do in 1874, and that is incorporate Ashanti into the British Empire, into the Gold Coast. And they make Prempeh and his queen there grovel. The British officials are on tins of a little pile of biscuit tins, and they're groveling and kissing their feet and agreeing that Ashanti will become a British protectorate. But that's not enough. The British want gold as well, and they say they want 50,000 ounces of gold. Prempeh doesn't have it, or he says he doesn't have it, and he is sent into exile, first to Sierra Leone and then to the Seychelles. He doesn't come back until 1924, and that is a picture of him sailing to the Seychelles on the right there.
I think this is really interesting, because the first when you look at Benin, there's a sort of almost the Benin Bronzes. There's also almost an accidental. It clearly wasn't accidental, but there's an accidental sequence of events in which the Benin, the Oba's trying to defend his territory, and you can see that happening here. And then the local colonial powers decide to take their own initiative. But here you really are highlighting the, as you say, jingoistic excess of empire at its most arrogant.
Yeah, I think that's true. I when it comes to Benin, I do actually believe, I'm slightly more cock-up than conspiracy inclined, basically. The British government is kind of shoved into committing an invasion, sending a punitive expedition, which it wasn't planning to do a few weeks earlier. But when some British officials are killed on the ground, whether it's through the Oba's order or whether in fact they were, headstrong chiefs who weren't under the control of the Oba, it's still not entirely clear. But it was a mess all round. It wasn't really premeditated. The British, in contrast, have had Ashanti in their sights for some time, and they're particularly interested in gold as well. Gold concessions. The Ashanti Gold Company still exists today, Anglo-Ashanti, that is beginning to take concessions.
And before that, the Congress of Berlin, the European powers have decided to divide up Africa, and so there's, the competing powers, and this is all out. I mean, basically,
Exactly. So, in the minds of Joseph Chamberlain, territory is not only commerce, it's prestige, and whatever you can grab, you prevent the French and the Germans from grabbing. And for those who know the geography of West Africa, you have the French immediately to the west of the Gold Coast in what is today Côte d'Ivoire, and you have the Germans immediately to the right in what is today Togo. So there's a lot of different things going on at once, which take us to this, from the Ashanti point of view, this tragic moment, this humiliating moment. So let me go on here. But interestingly, as so often is the case, the kingdom itself survives. And this is Prempeh II, who is back on the throne in the 1930s. And on the picture, where you can see an old man holding up a stool behind him, that is the famous golden stool. Now, a stool is like a throne to the Ashanti and to many other people in Akan, which is a wider ethnic group in West Africa. So to be installed is to take the throne. You have stool territories and so on, stool lands. But the golden throne is an object of great mystical power, which reputedly descended from the sky at the birth of the Ashanti nation. And although the British are always able to take much of the gold, they never take the golden stool itself. And the final war in 1900, so this is after Prempeh is in exile, is often called the War of the Golden Stool, because Sir Frederick Hodgson, the British governor, marches to Kumasi. The Ashanti are still not being fully cooperative, and he says, "Where is the golden stool? I demand it. I demand to sit on it." Now, this is utterly shocking to the Ashanti, who've hidden it from him. And in fact, nobody can ever, even the Ashanti cannot sit on the golden stool. It sits on it. It has its own throne beside him, in fact. So this extraordinary offensive speech actually sets off the final Anglo-Ashanti War of 1900-1901. But the point is, the stool has remained under Ashanti control, and here they are parading it again in the 1930s when it's safe for them to do so. And to this day, it is kept securely in the palace. It comes out 2 or 3 times a year, and only at any one time, only a very small group of select palace courtiers know where it is, in fact.
Amazing. We've got some questions coming in a tick. So when you finish talking about the slides, we've got a question from Alan Livingston, who I know is in Texas, so we'll come to him in just a second. So if we line up Alan, he can put a question to Barnaby.
Okay. I'll just, very quickly. So these are some of the treasures which have gone back. This is a particular sacred sword from the British Museum, and which are now in Kumasi. A sacred sword on the left. On the right, one of the things which this is where Ashanti meets Rococo, by the way, because this is one of the very interesting things as well. We think of these kingdoms as very isolated, but look, they've beaten into gold an object which looks to me as if it was made in the reign of George II here in England. So that's a sort of, a way in which cultures cross-fertilize each other. These are other treasures which have gone back, which are all now in Kumasi, which were in the British Museum, long-term loan. And so what you can see here is the British Museum curator, a woman called Julie Hudson, showing the Ashanti king, or say Tutu II, what she has given back to the Royal Palace Museum. And that is an exterior of the Royal Palace Museum in Kumasi, a building built in the 1920s for Prempeh when he came back from the Seychelles. So that is where, if anyone is in Ghana, and I was at this ceremony in May when these objects came back, and then I went back to Ghana in November of 2024 because I was curious to see, what are people you give these objects back, there's so much hyperbole around this in the West. Well, what actually people even, what does it matter 6 months on? And it was really interesting to talk to Ghanaians, but also people from Seattle or Seoul or Scarborough. I met a man from Scarborough, and I said, and he said he didn't know anything about this history. I said, well, what are you doing here? And he said, well, I Googled safest country in Africa, and it said Ghana. My wife didn't believe it, but I've come by myself. So I would advise people, go to the Mancha Palace Museum and live in, Ghanaians are wonderfully hospitable.
Let's while we're talking about this, because it's a really good question that Alan Livingston raises here, and I think it's worth putting in at this juncture. So, Alan, just open your microphone, bottom left-hand side of your screen, and you should be able to put your question directly to Barnaby. Alan, you need to open your microphone first, though. You there? Alan? Alan, if you can't open the microphone, I will ask the question for you. Which I'm going to go ahead and do. So there's a US. I know you know about this issue, Barnaby. It's a good one. There's a group in the US of African American activists who say that these objects from Western African countries are the reward for descendants of slave traders and deprivation of descendants of slaves who would have been able to visit and view them in the US or UK museums. What do you think of that argument?
So that's right, yeah. So there's a group called the Restitution Study Group, RSG, who have taken this case through various courts, fairly unsuccessfully so far, and made this case specifically in relation to the Benin Bronzes. And what they're saying is their ancestors were traded in exchange for the brass, which came primarily from the Portuguese, with which the bronzes were made, if you like. So they paid with their liberty for the Benin Bronzes. So they have a moral say in what should happen next. And I think this is, as you can imagine, an issue that has caught a lot of museums on the back foot and that they feel rather uncomfortable in dealing with. Two things I would say about this, and this is where I understand the argument. My frustration with it, and maybe we talked about this in London, Nick, is that this group has spent money on lawyers, spent money on PR, but ultimately, surely the real answers have to be in scholarship. And there is a fair amount of good evidence that the slave trade was not of prime importance to the Benin kingdom. It ebbed and flowed. But Benin was an inland kingdom. It was very, very difficult for European ships to get there. You had to leave big ships at the edge of the delta and go in on smaller ships. All your sailors died of smallpox and dysentery and yellow fever while you were waiting for the Oba to provide you with slaves. And there isn't the same evidence that Benin was waging wars to supply slaves to transatlantic traders. And what is annoying, I find, is that there's a fantastic book by a man called Alan Ryder called Benin and the Europeans, if people would like to look it up, written in the late 1960s. And to me, that book is the definitive study of Benin and the Europeans, and indeed the extent to which Benin has been involved in the slave trade. And so I say to the Restitution Study Group, to make your case stronger, go to the archives in Lisbon, in Amsterdam, because that's where the answers will be, and draw those links. Don't, put more videos on YouTube or hire fancy lawyers in London. Don't waste your money on that. Don't write, push this forward in terms of new knowledge, and that will bolster your case. The Ashanti Kingdom, undoubtedly much more involved and a much more symbiotic rise between its power and the transatlantic slave trade. There's no doubt about it, but I suppose what you might argue is a difference is that in the case of the Benin Bronzes, the argument has been the bronze was traded for the slaves. Well, the gold wasn't traded for anything. The Ashanti also had the gold. It was their own gold, if you see what I mean. And we nicked it, I suppose. But that has, I think Benin Bronzes, perhaps one reason it has a bit more resonance in the United States, because wherever you go in the United States, from LA to Seattle to New York. There are serious collections of Benin Bronzes. Ashanti gold is perhaps more of a British issue, although there are important collections in the United States as well.
Let's go to another question. Elaine is there. If you can just open your microphone, Elaine, and I don't know if we've got another slide there too. To maybe you want to do your next slide, and then we can go on to Elaine.
I think that was it, actually. Sorry.
Okay, fine. We can lose that. Well, literally.
Yes.
Go on, Elaine.
Thanks very much, Barnaby, and I much appreciated your description of the complexity of Nigerian polity. I'm somebody who survived a trip to Benin City's museum. Wasn't killed by dysentery, but I could have been killed by the traffic, as you will know. I want to know what you think is going to happen in the longer term around the Benin Bronzes, given how tricky things are, as you've described.
Yeah. So there are a number of different things. Yeah. So as you might have noticed, Elaine, I mean, in some quarters in the West and also in Nigeria, there's a kind of moral argument out there, which is like, these things were stolen by force. It's none of your business what happens to them when they go back. You've got no right to say they should go into a good museum. They belong to the king. They should go back to his palace. And of course, you have other people who say, no, the world has changed. The meaning of the objects has changed. What I hope is that some of the heat can be taken out of the argument, some of the culture war, I suppose, for want of a better expression, on both sides, and that we can see that there is a clear win-win. I think in the case of the Benin Kingdom, there is a desire for a recognition of a historical wrong that was done to them, but also a fairly astute realization that Benin Bronzes are wonderful ambassadors for their culture. And while they would like to have the moral and I suppose the practical ownership, of course they're not averse to the idea of Benin Bronzes being on display in London, Beijing, New York, Rome, Delhi. I mean, who wouldn't want their culture displayed around the world? And who really wants to live in a world in which the contents of our museums are constrained by the nation states, as borders as they are in 2025? So God knows there are enough Benin Bronzes. The British looted thousands of them, and I hope there can be a win-win situation. The politics in Britain are complicated. The politics in Nigeria are even more complicated, as you know.
It's worth mentioning at this point the film we saw when we went to a debate just at Lincoln's Inn. I think it was held by Queen Mary's College. I can't remember which college it was. And they showed a documentary called Dahomey, which is about the restitution of artifacts or religious symbols seized by the French and then returned because Macron promised to do so. And it's worth watching the documentary, if only for the last scenes of that. And there's a sense of moral outrage that so little has been returned. And the French, on the other hand, think they're doing this great thing and addressing this great big moral question. But the lecture theatre in which we sat and watched that film was also a sort of cauldron of moral opprobrium, in which there doesn't seem to be much room for the kind of nuance and space for complexity that you've highlighted. And the question I provocatively put at in that space was, how far do you go back? What point do countries have to return or examine the stuff in their museums that they hold? And this is perhaps not fair at all, but St. Mark's lions come from possibly from the Tang dynasty, and the Chinese could claim them because back in 1300 BC they were possibly in China. Where do you stop?
Yeah, so it's a tricky question, and it's one that does get raised. I think the response you got, although I do appreciate complexity, I think the response people gave to that question that evening, Nick, I do concur with it, and you stop at the point at which the issue is stops being alive or stops causing pain.
I'm going to push back at that one. What is nationalism? What is nationalism?
Nobody in Istanbul, Constantinople, feels pain over what is in St. Mark's Square in Venice. I stand to be corrected.
But potentially they could do. But potentially they could do. And
they could do if they stay on Twitter long enough.
Nationalism, 19th century nationalism is about creating myths around identity, around which nations are built upon and created. So you can arguably come up with some great affection for something that hasn't been bothered about for centuries.
I agree. I also think it's true that we in the West don't necessarily always appreciate our impact on relatively small, in this case, say, kingdoms in West Africa and what we did. I take you back, for example, to that ceremony I attended in Kumasi in November of last year. Does anyone in this country know? Does anyone know the king, know anything about Ashanti, let alone that we took away their king and sent him to the Seychelles for 28 years, 25 years? By the way, Nick, do you know who else went to the Seychelles? Leaders of Cyprus, Zanzibar, Nyasaland, the Maldives, Malaysia, Palestine, Egypt, and one or two more are going to come back to me after. It's going to really annoy me. Somaliland. We sent leaders of all those countries, troublesome chiefs, intellectuals, to a little group of islands in the middle of the Indian Ocean that, again, unless you're very rich and you've been on holiday, you don't even know anything about. So we have to be humble and we have to know more about what we did, I suppose.
Yeah. Right. That's a fair enough point. Well, listen, Barnaby, this has been fantastic. We are going to schedule the next tour, I think possibly in October. We need to come up with some dates for that. But if anybody is interested, do get in touch. We turn over every single stone possible. We start in the British Museum. We go to see the Benin Bronzes. We go to the Wallace collection and see some of the Ashanti gold. And then we are in St. Paul's to see the people who perpetrated all these things. And then we really do spend about a day and a half examining all the different dilemmas, moral, legal, around the questions of restitution. I do want to share one photograph, which is, if I just find the right thing, and it may take me a sec, is this wonderful chap. If I find him, here he is. Share. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
This chap is he's a relative of the Oba, so he is a prince of Benin, and he said when we went for a meal with him in Peckham, where it's obviously home to a strong group, the Nigerian community, and we had a really good discussion with him. Barnaby, can you remember what he emphasised? What his one condition was?
Well, I mean, I think, Prince Joseph, he gave us we had a pretty lively half hour with him in Peckham. I mean, to me, my enduring memory of his conversation, Nick, was just how fragile Nigeria is a country. I mean, he's a man who believes in Benin sovereignty, basically. The kingdom, he's far more, deferential, obviously, to his king than he is to any president of Nigeria. And he sees things very much in terms of what happens to the Benin kingdom. But was there something else that he brought up?
I think the one thing, so that I think you've highlighted, I think that's important to point out. But the one thing he said is that it's not about loans, it's about an apology. They have to recognize that they stole these artifacts from us. They stole these the bronzes from us. That was the most important thing. They can't send them back on loan, and they can't just and say that we are handing them over. They have to recognize that this was theft.
I try not to use the word stole. I know it's very, very fashionable these days, Nick. Everyone uses the word stole. Stole to me, I mean, I understand why people use it. I don't think it accurately describes the motivations, the feelings of the people who did it. I don't think they thought they were doing something wrong. And it kind of implies something covert, done with a guilty conscience in the middle of the night while no one's looking. Well, often, in fact, loot was taken in quite an organized way. I alluded to prize committees set up in such a way, money going to widows and bereaved soldiers and all the rest of it, and plus just a sense that this was what you did in a war when you conquered.
And I suppose his point is to say, look, it's not about returning them, it's about recognition of what you did was wrong.
Yeah, sure. And he made that point very forcefully, yes.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, listen, thank you very much. That's a great discussion, and we will be putting a recording of this on the website. So if anyone wants to go back over it, they can. And please do get in touch if you want to know more about the tour itself. And my thanks again to Barnaby for his time.